Hello and welcome to another video. I'm sat in an armchair and this is just a little brief introduction with the face cam to explain a little bit about this video. You would expect it to just be another SYBI, but on one of my favourite games, I have to say, Dark Souls 3. But I'd like to just ask a favour, I guess. Because this video is going to be the longest video that I've ever put out on my channel. So it's probably not going to do great just in general. But this video has also been the longest video I've ever tried to make. As in, like, the amount of hours I've put into this. It's currently the 29th of May as of recording this video. But I started recording the audio, writing the script, and recording the gameplay footage mid-February. So I've been doing this video for 3 months now, and it's all culminated in this. And so I really hope you enjoy it, and it would mean bucketfuls to me if you could like this video, subscribe if you're new, hit the notification bell, share it with your friends if you really like it. So thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy the video.
Dark Souls 3 is a game that a lot of people are familiar with, whether you're a long-time fan, casual player, or just someone who likes to see people freak out and rage over the hard bosses on YouTube. The methodology and gameplay of the Souls series, beginning with Demon's Souls in 2009, has been a common comparison for a lot of games these past few years. But now, with the release of Dark Souls 3 in 2016, we've seen the full story and the epic conclusion of the cycles of fire and dark that have been the focus of every playable character's quest. And what an incredible journey it's been for everyone who's played these games. But if you're sitting there thinking, what is this idiot on about? What is Dark Souls? Well, buckle in, my uneducated hollows, as I take you through a comprehensive review of Golden Joystick's Game of the Year winner, Dark Souls 3, and both of its amazing DLCs, and attempt to answer the question, should you buy it? Obviously, this review is unavoidably going to contain some spoilers for the game's plot, lore, and just general content. So if you want to avoid these, you can skip to the timestamp on the screen right now to hear my spoiler-free conclusion on if you should buy it or not. Let's start off with some things I think the game does well in its own regard. I'll be frequently comparing the finale of this series to its two predecessors, but first, there are several things that I would like to outline that this game does very well on its own accord. Straight off the bat, the game is inherently well designed from the standpoint of level design, having many varying locations for the player to explore and become intimate with. While some of those areas are inevitably going to resemble the look or embody the emotions that were caused in some areas of previous games, there's something about having such a bright, vivid, and unique location for the player to come to terms with that this game does almost flawlessly every time you enter a new area. For example, in my opinion, the two most stunning locations in the base game are Irithyll of the Boreal Valley and Lothric Castle. Both are intensely beautiful in their own rights, but they couldn't be more dissimilar to one another. Irithyll Valley is an area immediately after you've just spent the last hour crawling around in dark, dank, skeleton-infested catacombs, and boy does it make it feel worth it once you're out of there. You're immediately presented with a cliffside vista of the city, where you can see the skyline against the almost Arctic backdrop, a huge pale moon, faint aurora in the background, and thick swirling clouds, giving an immediate aura of wonder and almost tangible magic. Compare this with Lothric Castle. This is likely the second time you'll notice how good the skyboxes are in this game. Here, the sky is a rich red, the colour of dying fire. The surrounding architecture is comprised of many shades of black and brown, providing a pleasant yet foreboding contrast between the playable area and the skies beyond. These shades are indicative of the sense of disarray that the land has been left in due to the neglect of its prince, with the crimson skies representing his unwillingness to relink the fabled First Flame and the approaching Dark Age as the fire fades. Both areas are completely different stylistically, but when looked at from both an artistic standpoint and also knowing the context of the lore to this area, an entire new layer of depth is revealed, adding some extra appreciation to the level design present. Upon entering Lothric Castle is likely when you'll notice another feature that I personally love. The sun changes after you kill your third Lord of Cinder. The regular old sun that everyone is used to is replaced by a permanent eclipse, a deep black void surrounded by a thin corona of flickering flames. There isn't a specific piece of lore that instantly explains away this seemingly bizarre and kind of random phenomenon, although I'm tempted to theorise that due to the death of three lords, the world is becoming engulfed in darkness more quickly. That eclipse isn't caused by something in front of the sun, but rather the sun itself is being engulfed by darkness. It heavily resembles the dark sign, the brand signifying an accursed undead, which the player themselves is one of. It's the very thing that allows a hollow to die many times over, being reborn each time, but it sends the undead to insanity, ultimately becoming a hollow after enough deaths. Perhaps this aims to show us how the world is descending into insanity, becoming hollow and dark after the failure to link the fire occurs. This visual provides no actual in-game effect, and is just for aesthetic purposes only, but it does add a lot of atmosphere to your boss fights when they're set beneath a potentially dying star. Combat in Dark Souls has never been better than in its third installment. Along with a wide variety of weapons and armour, an increased weight limit to help with rolling, and also much faster enemies, the challenge of completing a Souls game feels higher than ever. Some people might argue that giving the player so many options of weapons leads to many of them feeling redundant and too similar to justify a lot of their existences. On the contrary, with relatively few exceptions, the differences between weapons, even within the same categories, is definitely noticeable, which can greatly affect your preferred playstyle. The speed, reach, damage output, and stamina usage of varying weapons are all factors to consider when choosing how to equip yourself. In my opinion, character customization and stylistic choices also have important places in a Souls game, further expressing how important the decision to include such a large amount of weapons and armor pieces is to gameplay. Also, hitboxes are undoubtedly at their peak of quality in Dark Souls 3, at least whilst in the normal single-player game mode. I cannot and will not argue that every single hitbox is flawlessly designed, this is just untrue. However, I will strongly defend that there are hitboxes within the game that, with some close analysis, are fundamentally perfect. I think the fact that some of these hitboxes are so well pieced together adds a new level of appreciation for the effort that went into the weapon design. I'd like to direct your attention to two examples of such hitboxes in action. Some bugs and glitches are unfortunately still present within the game, which some people might have some issues with. Despite this, you as a new player will be unlikely to encounter many, if any of them. The majority of glitches are hard to perform, with multiple actions needing to be taken in a specific order to produce the desired effect. Bugs still in the game are minor, and are not game-breaking or immersion-ruining. An enemy may clip through the wall partially with a weapon, or a camera bug might cause enemies' attacks to just completely miss if you turn your back. But these never really seem to ruin game immersion and only offer slight inconveniences at worst. Two-phase bosses are common within the Souls universe, and indeed most games with a boss system at all, where bosses go down briefly before surprising you with another bout of energy and sprinting after you as you celebrate your easy win. However, I would like to think that FROMSOFTWARE, the creators of the game, knew people had cottoned onto this trick. So where do you go from two phases? Well, pretty obvious. 3 phases. Thankfully, despite the obviousness of this, they made the sensible decision to actually only include 2 bosses with such a mechanic. There's one boss like this in each of the DLCs, with just 2 bosses with 3 phases in the entire Souls series. This little trick is wonderful for adding something extra to a boss battle, and it makes you feel like you truly won once the 3rd phase is out of the way. The first example of such a boss is Sister Frieda, in the first DLC, The Ashes of Ariandel. This is done especially well here, as the boss seems to be fully dead, with the player receiving a powerful upgrade material for their troubles. But then, after a small anecdote is read aloud, the boss springs back to life in a burst of black flames, surprising you with a huge AoE attack and a terrifying array of new attacks. Truly epic and menacing stuff. The other boss with 3 phases is Slave Knight Gale, the final ever boss battle in Dark Souls history. Personally, I just love this boss. Whilst he doesn't invoke the same surprise as Frida does with his third phase, it's still a serious sight to behold. He stumbles for a moment before exploding into a shower of red homing skulls, which summon fucking lightning bolts to strike down on the spots they land on. His attacks are increasingly furious and manic, embodying his desperation to possess the powerful Dark Soul. I think that the rarity of these bosses adds a lot to their worthiness in the player's repertoire of bosses, adding extra bragging rights to those that actually manage to defeat them. Finally for this segment, boss design has always been a strong point in the Souls series, with many creative and unique examples from earlier games, such as Artorias, Ornstein and Smough, Manus and Velstadt. Dark Souls 3 is no exception to this. However, one boss in particular stands out as a landmark achievement for FromSoftware. The geniuses in the design team have created the first and only thick female boss, the Dancer of the Boreal Valley. She's undeniably strong, dual-wielding magic and fire-infused curved swords, and capable of spinning like a Beyblade until you're entirely dead. Sticking to the back of her is a smart idea to avoid her slashes, but it also means that her less than impressively large arse takes centre stage of your camera view. Was this intentionally done by FromSoft, or just a mere coincidence? From this point on, I'll be using comparisons to the prior two games in the series to illustrate how good the third entry truly is. If you're at all familiar with the structure of a Souls game, you'll know that there's a simple 6-step pattern that they always follow. 1. You wake up in a prison or an abandoned area. 2. You find the hub location and you're leveling waifu. 3. Go exploring. 4. Defeat 4 special bosses, which are super important. 5. Use the items that these 4 special bosses drop to beat the big end boss. And 6. You can either choose to commit arson on the entire world, or be a responsible adult and walk away. Sounds pretty straightforward, right? That's because that aspect of the game is always told to you within the first 2 steps. You always know your objective from the moment you arrive at your hub world, or even before. Find the Lord Souls, or the Lord of Cinder, or the Old Ones, and then use these to beat the end boss. Dark Souls 3 definitely doesn't veer from this, which is a good thing in my opinion. Having such a clear-cut objective from the moment you begin playing helps to establish a sense of importance to certain names or places, and allows for a lot of deviating from the track on the player's behalf. Knowing that you only need to ultimately defeat 4 bosses when all is said and done, allows you as a player to begin exploring alternate areas as almost extra content on top of the main story. It's a great way to add to the world without detracting from the story that was set up early on. Then, once you defeat one of these 4 bosses, it feels like a major achievement, and an important milestone to remember on your journey. This is where Dark Souls 1 and 3 excelled. They both set up the names and almost personalities of the bosses within the introductory cutscene, to give you some information on the challenges you'll face and how strong they're actually going to be. When you enter the boss room and realise you're going to have to fight one of these aforementioned characters, it sets up big rewards for you if you succeed. Then, once defeated, you'll feel like you've climbed a huge mountain because of this setup, regardless of how easily you actually beat it. Dark Souls 2 has the same plot setup, but where it falls down is that it doesn't have a single name drop. Due to this, you can enter a boss room and not actually know if this is a quote-unquote special boss, which are called Old Ones in Dark Souls 2. It doesn't make you feel like this is going to be important to anything other than general game progression. This is especially true for 2 of the Old Ones in particular, the Lost Sinner and the Rotten. Both are heavily underwhelming, and don't feel different, stronger, or more important than any of the other bosses in the game. Another win for Dark Souls 3 is thematic consistency, found in the main 4 Lords of Cinder. As the name implies, fire, specifically that which is fading, is the central theme of their boss fights. To begin with, most of the bosses do not embody this element, yet when they're weakened and are closer to death, they begin to draw upon the flames for strength, using them to their advantage against you. This relatively minor detail helps to establish the consequences of being linked to the first flame, the very thing that the player knows that they are connected to and seeks out themselves. There is countless heaps of lore in every single Souls game, Be that the story of how Gwyn and the other lords fought the dragons of old and claimed the powers of fire as their own, or how King Vendrick was tricked by the beauty Nashandra and went hollow in the crypts below the earth. Following this, the lore divulged in Dark Souls 3 certainly doesn't disappoint, with it being our last look into the world of Hollows. From the moment the intro cutscene plays out, you'll be itching to know more about what on earth is happening in this land that is beginning to unravel. It sets up that of a world doomed, in the eyes of the Firekeepers at least, to be sent to the Age of Darkness. "The fire fades, and the lords go without thrones," is a quote from the intro, and is something to immediately cling onto, as you get acquainted with who these lords are almost immediately afterwards. They appear as imposing characters, wielding menacingly strong-looking weapons, all set to the eerie yet inspiring soundtrack that is somewhat of a staple in Dark Souls. Instantly following this, the narrator reveals that in truth, the lords will not sit at their thrones, and that is where you, as an unkindled, undead warrior, must take matters into your own hands. Dark Souls excels at world building through the world itself instead of just through direct explanations. If you doubt this, take a scroll through your own inventory at the descriptions of items and weapons. Countless examples of otherwise unmentioned characters or places give glimpses into trivia and knowledge that you just wouldn't find anywhere else, solidifying that in this world, nothing is quite as it seems at first glance. I won't go too much into the lore of certain events, of characters in this video. I'll leave you to figure out the finer details in your playthrough. Though, if you've already played through once and fancy knowing more about this place the next time you play, check out a YouTuber by the name of VartiVidya. He's done many lore videos for all three games, and his voice is like that of some wizened storyteller. His link's going to be in the description, so be sure to check him out. And be sure that you learn a lot about the Ring City. That place and its denizens are some of the fucking coolest shit that has ever been shown in a Souls game, in my opinion, and it honestly is so much fun to hear and think about. Just learn about it, okay? Dark Souls 3 also expands upon the lore of previous games, giving us several answers to questions which plagued early players' minds where intentional blanks were left in the past. Such examples of revelations include the answer to who Gwyn's firstborn was and where he went, or where the furtive pygmy, so easily forgotten, who appeared briefly in the first game as a possessor of the Dark Soul, wound up at the hand of Gwyn's mercy. Other callbacks to the previous installments are scattered throughout too. Ones more obvious include the Sigurd quest and how similar he is to the earlier, equally jovial Siegmeyer, or how the very end boss of the main game actually uses a very similar moveset to that of Gwyn's, as well as a remix of his theme that will instantly bring back memories of your first battle against the true Lord of Cinder. And of course, we see a recurrence of the once great city of Anor Londo, and how its last guardian is being slowly destroyed by a rogue Lord of Cinder. These are just a few ways in which Dark Souls 3 calls back to previous entries with both gameplay and storytelling aspects. There are definitely more examples, but these are the ones that stood out to me most clearly. Just like this game is the first to have 3-phase boss fights, it's also the first to have 3 endings. Well, technically Dark Souls 2 also did this, but you need to own the DLCs for it to access it. And in reality there's 4 endings for Dark Souls 3, but you only actually get achievements for 3 of them. In Dark Souls 3, the first and second endings are fairly obvious once you know how to access them. Now, this section contains major spoilers for the literal end of the game coming up, so you can skip ahead to this timestamp on the screen now for me to stop talking about endings. You've been warned. As the player, you've been led to believe that linking the fire is the only correct option, and the Firekeeper always tries to reinforce this ideology. Yet, should you find the old Firelink Shrine and the Firekeeper's eyes and soul, and present them to your Firekeeper, you'll have access to a second, more disturbing seeming option. You can let the fire fade, and the world fades to black, and an age of darkness shall reign for many years to come. This seems inherently bad. After all, who knows what the darkness will bring with it? Throughout the series, the abyss and the deep have always been seen as the height of evil, and this is true, they do represent a darkness in mankind. But even when the land is lost to darkness, will it truly be ruined? After all, the Age of Darkness has often been delayed for thousands of years, through countless heroes linking the First Flame. But has this ever stopped the undead curse, or stop the fire from exerting its allure on many via the powers gained in linking the fire. Without a break from the eons of light, the darkness will ever threaten to consume the world. Nothing will stop the darkness, only delay it for a number of years. Should you pick this seemingly bad ending, the world seems more peaceful, as the dark closes in on you and the enlightened Firekeeper. And just as nothing could prevent the darkness forever, so too will light return to the world one day, as tiny fleeting embers dance across the night. Both of these endings represent the cycle of renewing the first flame, which is present in all of the Souls games. However, a third semi-secret ending is present in this game. The Lord of Hollows ending is unlocked through the player completing a rather lengthy and complex quest involving the Pilgrims of Lothric and Anri of Astora. I won't spoil how to achieve this, though it's easily Googleable. You get a title bestowed to your character and a unique cutscene in the final moments of your playthrough, arguably the coolest in the entire game. The fact that it's locked behind such an arduous quest makes it feel somehow more special. That, and certain characters will even acknowledge you as the Lord of Hollows, which is so fucking cool to hear. I'd aim for this ending on your second playthrough, as sometimes it's quite easy to miss quest checkpoints to allow you to complete this one. Replayability is and has always been a huge part of the Dark Souls experience. The vast array of weapons at your disposal in this game to allow for different playstyles, the ever-increasing difficulty of enemies, the greater soul drops, and multiple endings all add incentive to play another new game cycle, to see if you can best the game once more. Even just going in a second time can increase your confidence in these games in general. Once you figure out tactics for the bosses that give you some really intense trouble the first time you played, you feel like you've truly learned to play the game quote-unquote properly, though there's no right or wrong method for playing, of course. On top of this, in your first playthrough it's quite easy to miss characters' questline milestones, or fumble in some sense and potentially kill someone important. Adding one of the endings behind one such quest provides extra justification to face the ramped up challenge of a new game cycle. And of course, there's all the achievements that are able to be earned. In new game cycles, the player has access to upgraded versions of the rings they used the first time round to balance things out a little bit more. They provide an increase to whatever bonus they gave on the original ring, with +1 and +2 varieties accessible in New Game Plus and New Game Plus 2 respectively. +3 versions are also available for certain rings, though these are only obtainable in the Ring City DLC, making them a little more exclusive unfortunately. If you've played Dark Souls 1, then you'll likely think that one of the hardest and most memorable bosses is Ornstein and Smough. This duo is, in my opinion, the biggest challenge in that game. Two enemies, one fast, one slow. One is imbued with the power of lightning, the other wielding a huge fucking hammer. It's not an easy task to defeat them, and the difficulty of beating this boss made it stick in the minds of players forever. In the sequels, it was decided to bring back fights with Ornstein in order to stir up some nostalgia and give you additional elements to his story. I don't really have an issue with this, it's good lore after all. Unfortunately, Dark Souls 2 puts this fight way too early in the game, and as an optional boss as the old Dragon Slayer, meaning that he's pretty underwhelming, unrewarding, and a disappointing fight all round, if you even manage to find him and fight him. He also has some fucking dark magic powers now. Why? It doesn't make sense. I think that the team working on Dark Souls 3 realised this and decided they were gonna do yet another Ornstein fight, but make it just way better. In this game, you fight a suit of armour that resembles Ornstein's, animated by the pilgrim butterflies in the nearby skies. He's back to his old lightning attacks with some new shockwave attacks, but with a new weapon and shield, which as an added bonus you can obtain and use yourself once you defeat him. The fight soundtrack is amazing, with the choir in full swing right from the moment you enter the fog wall. It feels like the homage to the original fight that Ornstein deserved. A true reimagining of the fight instead of just the same fight with a different colour scheme and elemental power like that in Dark Souls 2. Dragons are a crucial element to the story of Dark Souls. In the intro sequence for the first game, we learn that they were all wiped out besides Seath, who betrayed his own kind in the pursuit of power. But through playing the game we find the Everlasting Dragon, one of the descendants of the last true dragons, hidden away in Ash Lake. Wyverns and drakes do not count as dragons, but rather some form of distant relative or cousin. Then, in the DLC of the first game, we find the Black Dragon Calamite, the last of the ancient dragons. The theme of dragons continues in the second game, always emphasising how rare true dragons actually are. Dragons are rarely fought as bosses in Souls games, Calamite and Sin being the only true, non-warped or corrupted dragon bosses in the first two games. Yet something about these bosses' fights always felt unsatisfying as dragon entities. These mighty dragons aren't too hard to fell, provided you can dodge good and you have a high damage output. In Dark Souls 3, it seemed like we may not get a true dragon fight, only more wyverns and drakes. But then, tucked away at the end of the second DLC, behind a hidden wall, a true dragon. Just the one. Pulsing with dark energy from millennia spent battling the abyss, all for the sake of the gods that raised him. As a descendant of the original archdragons, and as an immortal entity, he was able to perform his task without end, long after the gods that raised him died. This dragon is Dark Eater Midir, and I regard him as the very best of the dragon fights. The other two bosses tend to fly around a lot, spraying fire as they move. Of course, this is going to be expected of a dragon-type enemy. The downside to this is the lack of maneuverability from the bosses themselves. They remain quite static through many of their animations, and the direction of fire attacks is generally either straightforward, straight down, or in a sweeping motion from side to side. This is fine, but it doesn't make you feel like the boss you're fighting has a full mastery of their powers. Another complaint of mine is the size of these two bosses. They're relatively large, probably about 4 players high and 7 or 8 players long if the player lay down, excluding the tail. For bosses in Dark Souls 1 and 2, they're quite big. But for dragons, they just seem a little bit measly. Midir, on the other hand, goes way beyond both of these fights. He's visually impressive, with bright fire contrasting heavily against his onyx black scales, and his size is utterly monumental. He's at least twice as long as the other two dragons, and slightly taller. His attacks are ruthless, constantly slashing with his claws, lunging and snapping at you with his gaping mouth, and even swiping at you with his tail. His fire attacks are varied, with diagonal jets while flying, flaming pools when directed downwards, and seemingly random outbursts of fire as he charges at you. And when you think you've got the hang of it, he draws on his abyssal powers and unleashes a torrent of dark energy, and now his entire moveset has changed, and his regular laser attack is upgraded to the most devastating attack possible. Clearly this is not a dragon boss to be sneered at, and for that reason I regard him as one of the most impressive and memorable bosses in Souls history. DLC is available for every single Souls game. There's unfortunately only one for Dark Souls 1, which is Artorias of the Abyss. But it set the standard, the golden standard, for additional content for the rest of the games. Dark Souls 2 had a whopping 3 DLCs, each representing one of the crowns of the kings of old. Sadly, only one of these, the Crown of the Old Iron King, was truly well received by the fanbase, though there are positives and negatives for all of them. Dark Souls 3 took the middle road, and 2 DLCs were released. The first, The Ashes of Ariandel, was relatively well received despite only having a meagre 2 bosses. One of these was the aforementioned Sister Frieda, our first example of a 3-phase boss. This DLC was good in my opinion, but it seemed a little lackluster. The landscape is barren and icy, totally fitting a world where rot has overtaken, and flame is needed to burn it away. The first boss is relatively uninspired, and also totally optional to beat the DLC, but his dog is pretty cool, so I give him points for that. The areas leading up to the second boss, which is Sister Frieda, are quite cool though, and I'm a big fan of how the underground location looks, where all the flies and rot is. And of course, a kick-ass second boss, which was thoroughly enjoyable. Overall, I'd give it a strong 7 out of 10. The real jewel of these DLCs is our second entry, the Ringed City. Even the name sounds undoubtedly impressive. In this DLC, everything will either confuse or send the player running. The world is collapsing in on itself, the lands themselves converging on the Ringed City, and you're slap bang in the middle of it all. Everything is going to shit, with concentrations of abyssal energy infesting the areas you'll explore. Mountains of ash and twisting roots of arch trees are common here, with small, unsuspecting merkmen, lumbering Herald Legion knights, and stalking angel-like creatures making up your enemy base for the first main area. the Dread Heap. Then, when you finally make it to the end of this treacherous area, you'll be faced with a choice. Do you leap into the pit before you, or give up and walk away? Of course, this being Dark Souls, you're going to need to jump into this pit, despite all of your intuition saying otherwise. Upon landing in the massive hollow trunk of an arch tree, 2 demons awake after many years of dormancy, giving you your first boss fight of this DLC, and a truly epic one at that. This DLC doesn't hold back on good bosses, with this being the final installment of all Dark Souls. After your eventual victory over the demons, you'll be whisked away to the Ring City, in a cutscene reminiscent of that when you first enter Anolondo in the first game. Here, agile and varied Ring Knights, monstrous hollow clerics, scuttling locust breachers, giant judicators, and the dangerous Iron Dragon Slayer armor will all assail you as you attempt to make progress. Dark Eater Midir is also able to be observed at frequent intervals, always watching you from afar, until taking his chance to strike. The second boss you're going to find is probably the worst one of the entire DLC, Half-Light. It's what's known as a Covenant boss, where another player of Dark Souls 3, in the Spears of the Church Covenant, will act as the boss if you're online. If you're offline, you'll be attacked by a scrawny guy with 2 painting guardians as backup. Not a fun boss, just a slight obstacle on the way to the real final bosses. Then you've got the choice of fighting Midir, if you knocked him off the bridge earlier, or Slave Knight Gale, at the end of the universe. Personally, I find Gale more fun and satisfying than Midir, but make your own choice. On top of an amazing set of bosses, other than stupid fucking Half-Light, this DLC is also packed full of storytelling goodness, and a few secrets too. See if you can figure out the Show Your Humanity puzzle by yourself. That takes real fucking brains. All of this culminates into one of the finest DLCs FromSoftware has ever produced. It even rivals the first for enjoyability, so this is a must-play. Now, unfortunately, I've got to go over the negative aspects to Dark Souls 3. I would love to sit here and say that it's a flawless game and it's got no imperfections, but I want you to have a real review of this game before heading in. In my opinion, hardly any of these flaws actually affects the fun factor for me, but at the end of the day, they're still flaws, and they must be detailed as adequately as I can for this to be an honest review. First off, let's get the biggest complaint of mine and a few other people's out of the way with first. Dark Souls 1 introduced us to a world where a linear path was laid out, but didn't necessarily need to be followed. For this reason, from the moment you enter Firelink Shrine in the first game, you have many conceivable advancement paths to explore, and along with this, a large number of bosses that are both necessary to be defeated, whilst others are completely optional. Relatively few bosses need to be beaten to actually finish the first game. In total, 9 bosses are completely optional in Dark Souls 1. When we compare this to Dark Souls 3, we find that there are only 6 bosses that you do not have to defeat to beat the game. The lack of branching paths in this sense, and the requirement to usually explore the majority of the branches where they appear, leads to some fairly linear gameplay. This sort of playstyle is deceivingly rare in Souls games, and in regards to getting to choose how you progress, this is kind of a bad thing. On the other hand, in my opinion, this is not such a big issue. With the upgraded textures and lighting effects compared to the previous games, bringing with it greater variety in areas to explore, having less branching paths means that players are likely to not miss an area and be unable to appreciate it. Veterans of the old games might prefer things to be like how they were, but if you've never known anything else, this won't seem like such a big deal when the areas are relatively broad to explore anyway. Compared to the spellcasting system of Dark Souls 2, prepare to be underwhelmed by the spells and miracles in Dark Souls 3. Whilst they might look super cool and flashy, they're heavily demanding on your level requirements and the amount of focus points they consume. In the past, you just had a set number of spells and you could replenish them with various items, and this was enough to make sorcery an actually viable build. Now if you try making a miracle build in Dark Souls 3 that's suitable for even just PvE, you'd be laughed at. In PvP, the image is even worse, as most players are able to easily dodge every variety of spell you could cast at them, due to their simple telegraphing and long casting times. The only viable miracles for PvP are buffs such as Tears of Denial and Dark or Lightning Blade. For PvE, Pyromancies are a decent choice of weapon, having high damage despite their relatively low FP cost. Though, you should be aware that for higher tiers of spells as you approach the endgame, a lot of dedication into leveling faith or intelligence may be required just to simply use them a few times. And don't forget to level up attunement. This will increase your FP by some marginal amounts each time, similar to how Vigor does it for HP. But again, it's all a compromise. If you focus on leveling attunement and intelligence, for example, your HP and equipment load may suffer as a consequence. This leaves you wearing lighter armors so you don't fat roll, reducing your defense to low levels, meaning your small HP will quickly deplete in close combat. So the moral of the story is to only have a spell or miracle build at your own risk in Dark Souls 3. With all of the multitudes of bosses in the Dark Souls lore, some are bound to be easier than others, though you would hope these are to the start of the game in order to ramp things up later. Sometimes though, one or two will slip through the cracks and make it to the late game stages, despite having an ultimately simple way to defeat them. Dark Souls 3 has two such bosses, being Yhorm and the Ancient Wyvern. Whilst from a lore perspective, Yhorm's gimmicky fight makes sense, the Ancient Wyvern is just a one-hit kill if you know what you're doing. You may likely never even interact with the Wyvern past hitting it in the legs once, realizing something's wrong and following the obvious path around. Whilst the enemies in the area make up for the lack of challenge in this boss, if you find the right path it's possible just to sprint past all of them and one-shot the Wyvern. Gimmick fights are nothing new in Dark Souls, and their inclusion usually leads to a lot of backlash from the community. Yhorm's fight didn't stir up much trouble, however. The lore explaining why this is such an easy fight makes sense when viewed from the perspective of Yhorm himself, and the weapon used to defeat him, the Storm Ruler, calls back to the weapon of the same name used in Demon's Souls. This little nostalgia piece makes the fight more tolerable for most of the community. Yet I wouldn't call the Ancient Wyvern a boss to write home about from any aspect, unfortunately. Whilst I highly praise most of the areas of this game, there are of course those which stoop below the expected standard of awe-inspiring difficulty or beauty. An example of such an area is Farron Keep. This area is bad for multiple reasons. It's a typical Dark Souls poison swamp type area, which might bring back some traumatic memories of Blighttown, but don't worry, it doesn't have the awful wonky wooden platforming sections. Your aim here is to make it through the swamp to the large stone gate on the opposite side, extinguishing the fires of the 3 chimneys along the way. This isn't shown explicitly and can only be learnt from accidentally clicking to interact on one of the fires, which triggers a cutscene, showing the tops of the other 3 chimneys above the canopy of the trees. The mud in this area is poisonous to move through, and also deepens in several places, meaning that you move at what is effectively a snail's pace. The enemies are of course unaffected by this speed decrease, and will continue to attack you at ferocious pace. The large shambling Eldergrew are enough of an irritant with their surprising speed when they spot you, and hefty tree stump that they'll just use to crush you with. But the real menace of this area is the basilisks. Lightning fast, they shoot out foul yellow mist that inflicts curse upon you at a relatively alarming rate. And once the status bar for this fills up, it's game over. Instant death. Just kill them as soon as possible for safe measure. This area is a real slog to get through, but the boss past that stone gate is ultimately worth the sacrifice, as it's one of the most badass bosses of this entire game. Another area that really grinds at players' gears is the very beginning of the Irithyll area, immediately following the central Irithyll bonfire, until the next bonfire at the Church of Yoshka. It's not as long as Farron Keep by any stretch, but the sudden increase in difficulty of just the regular common enemies, and the huge variety of attack types, really puts a strain on pretty much any player. Here's a short list of the things you'll need to deal with. Fast swiping attacks from Pontiff Knights, slow thrusting attacks from the Hags, ranged attacks from the Fire Witches, AoE fire attacks, humming magic attacks, and frostbite build-up. This combination of details to keep on top of makes the area infinitely frustrating to work through systematically. I asked my friend who has played Souls games plenty of times, and he agreed that this was one of the worst areas to play. I asked him for any tips he could give to new players, and he advised, sprint through to the cathedral, or try to aggro one enemy at a time. Fighting more than one knight at once is just a pain. In short, just speed through the fucking area to the Church of Yoshka bonfire, and then you've got some relative safety from then on. Working backwards through this area to obtain the items you likely missed is much simpler, as none of the enemies walk towards you by default. Just a friendly tip. When we spoke about bugs and glitches briefly earlier, there was one bug that I failed to bring to your attention, and for some reason still exists to this day. Everyone knows who has played a Souls game that the dogs in Soulsborne games are the worst. Hands down, they're just insufferable enemies all around, with just seemingly random attacks that you just can't predict, high speeds, and the fact that they generally group together in packs. The dogs in Dark Souls 3 are flat out the worst. Can you guess why? I'll give you a few seconds to think. It's because they can fucking teleport. Why can they do this? What advantage to the gameplay does teleporting rabid dogs have? None at all. There's an explanation for why this happens, but I'm not going to take the time to do so. Instead, I'll direct you to this video by Limit Breakers, which explains it way better than I could. The link's in the description for you to watch. This is the only bug that affects gameplay in my opinion, and sometimes it's kind of funny to experience firsthand, so I guess it's alright to stay in the game. This next negative aspect to Dark Souls 3 is a relatively minor complaint in the grand scheme of things, but one that I thought I should address. From the very start of the game, the Pus of Man is introduced as an enemy variation, and even seen to be infecting the very first boss. This would lead one to believe that this effect is significant within the story of the game. Perhaps it's a miasma spreading throughout the land, or some evil entity infesting inside normally peaceful creatures, or at least normally less hostile creatures. But these questions are sadly never really answered. They're creatures of the abyss that are abnormally strong for the creatures they're controlling, but that's about the limit of what we learn to do with these odd recurring enemies. Before I learnt about the actual lore of the game, I suspected that they would have more involvement with explaining how the world got to be in its current state, but this was not to be. This isn't a huge gripe with the game, however, I just assumed that they were more important than they were. Whilst replayability and the idea of cycles is fundamental towards the gameplay of all Dark Souls games, the lack of variation in enemies or item movement in Dark Souls 3 leads the game to not be as interesting as it could be. Mods exist to fix this, with item randomizers available, as well as mods that increase the difficulty and placement of enemies, readily accessible online for the PC version of the game, but this doesn't feel quite right. Dark Souls 2 tried this mechanic, with items in different places, and additional obstacles to overcome like NPC invaders, and slight boss fight alterations, and it worked really well for an extra challenge in the new game cycles. Dark Souls 3 doesn't do this, which leads to some of the gameplay feeling too repetitive to be worth repeating the playthrough. Despite this, I just enjoy replaying the game because it allows me to re-experience the areas and bosses I've grown to adore, always providing and finding something that I missed in my previous runs. Trophies and achievements are available throughout Dark Souls 3, with a trophy being gained for every boss you defeat, as well as a few other rewards for fully upgrading a bonfire or reinforcing a weapon to its max. This is great, as it encourages players without these achievements to strive for whatever comes next in the game. This is obviously true of most games, and is a familiar mechanic for motivating a player to continue despite the hardships presented in the game. Annoyingly though, the DLC areas for Dark Souls 3 don't have a single achievement or trophy. Why? I assume they just forgot to add them in with the downloadable content, but surely this could be relatively easily patched. It's not like this function is impossible, because the DLC for Bloodborne has achievements that lie in a separate section to that of the main game. Regardless, the inclusion of DLC trophies would be much appreciated, though 3 years on from the original release of the DLCs, I doubt they're coming anymore. Also, as mentioned previously, one of the endings to the game doesn't actually have an associated achievement. It requires some pretty devious thinking to figure out, so it almost makes sense why you don't get awarded for achieving it. In conclusion, Dark Souls 3 is a truly amazing experience. Whether you're totally new to the Souls series or a complete veteran, it was my first Souls game, and I had no knowledge of it prior to this. I didn't even know of its legendary difficulty to begin with. Going in with a totally blank slate, the Souls series is one of the finest works of fiction in gaming that you could have the pleasure of playing and discovering. Its method of storytelling is unique to the point that the in-depth lore compels a player to desire to know the full story. Yet you could happily play through the entire game with nothing but an understanding of the plot and the end goal, and have an equally great time playing it. Despite being famed for its difficulty, the true challenge of a Souls game is learning to accept loss. You're going to die, obviously, but you always have a second chance to gain your souls back. The game isn't unfair in how it presents your obstacles and foes, as usually there's a logical way to approach any given scenario that might just require a few extra seconds of thought before you charge in. You're rewarded for planning tactics prior to action, whereas by heading straight into danger with a hack and slash mentality will probably end your journey prematurely. Something as simple as learning your enemy's attacks and the appropriate times to dodge can seriously affect how hard you find this game. Even just blocking with a shield can get you by in a tough situation if you've got the stamina to cover it. This game has its downsides, just as every other game does, but they don't truly affect long-term gameplay, thankfully. The game itself and challenge in Dark Souls 3 is enough to offset the very few negative aspects of the game. Whereas you could easily pick up a shooter or an MMORPG style game, jump in, get some easy wins, does that truly validate the journey that you took to get to those wins? There's definitely a reason why so many games are described as Souls-likes, whether they deserve the title or not. In my eyes, a Souls-like game should challenge the player to a degree that they aren't used to, but feel confident enough that they can learn to overcome, retaining the same rewarding feeling of defeating a troublesome boss or area. Overall, I feel confident in saying that anyone can pick up this game and play it, providing they're willing to learn a new way of dealing with combat and incorporating some level of patience into how you deal with enemies and obstacles. Giving this game a score from 1 to 10, I can happily give Dark Souls 3 an exceptional 9.5 out of 10. The positives far outweigh the negatives in this wonderful game, and I encourage anyone on the fence about whether to buy it to absolutely give it a go. If what you're looking for is an easy or relaxing ride, this game isn't for you. On the other hand, if what you're looking for is a game with a medieval style aesthetic that will push your limits of reaction times and compatibility, as well as providing a story-rich world for you to explore at your leisure, and some of the best soundtracks to ever grace your ears, then Dark Souls 3 might just be the perfect game for you.
I would name this painting after thee. I see. We are much alike.